Some have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Max Sax, and welcome to tonight's CPI conference. That rendition right here of what you just heard was my version of the anthem of the only legitimate German country after the crushing of Rosa Luxemburg's revolt in 1919, the German Democratic Republic. And the title of that national anthem is Auferstanden aus Ruinen, or in English, Rising from the Ruins. And I feel a special connection with this anthem, being like in the context of like where the American left is right now, meaning that we as the American left have to remold ourselves, and we do have to rise from where the ruins are, that like where the American left is right now. And yeah, that's why I chose to play it. Now I'd like to begin this conference with introducing our Chief of Ceremonies, Des James.
Hello, friends and comrades, brothers and sisters. Welcome back. Center for Political Innovation. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. We got a great show in store for you. Web conference. It is March, International Women's Day, International Women's Month. Should it be? CPI is dedicated to promoting the struggle of our women comrades. We'll also be talking a bit about NATO and the role of imperialism and the fight against fascism. And to introduce this, we have a pledge of unity from Comrade Caleb Maupin.
Great.
Yeah, well, a while back, some of us were looking into how to kind of build unity in our organization. And we came across the pledge of the World Democratic Youth Federation. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union formed something called the World Federation of Democratic Youth. And it was an attempt to unite revolutionary, anti-imperialist, democratic, and communist youth organizations from around the world to work to make sure something like the horrific war, the Second World War, never happened again. Now, obviously, the Center for Political Innovation is for people of all ages. So we had to adjust the World Democratic Youth Federation pledge. But we decided we will be opening our CPI events with this pledge. So if those who are watching, are participating, could please raise their right hand, and I will read the pledge. We pledge that we shall remember this unity, forged at the end of the Second World War, not only today, not only this week, this year, but always, until we have built the world we have dreamed of and fought for. We pledge ourselves to build the unity of the people of the world, all races, all colors, all nationalities, all beliefs, to eliminate all traces of fascism from the earth, to build a deep and sincere international friendship among the peoples of the world, to keep a just and lasting peace, to eliminate want, frustration, and enforced idleness. We have come to confirm the unity of all people, to salute our comrades who have died, and to pledge our word that skillful hands, keen brains, and bold enthusiasm shall never more be wasted in a war. Thank you very much.
Right, I haven't held up my hand up for a salute since the Cub Scouts. It kind of hurts a little bit, but there is something to believe in and something to fight for. And that's the people and the cause of socialism and the working class. I just want to give a few introductory remarks. I guess I'll start out with today's topic of celebrating International Women's Day and celebrating International Women's Month. And if people watch my show, Anti-Imperialist America, I like to bring proletarian culture into discussion. It is the base, the economic base that creates the superstructure of culture. And we analyze culture, we can get from a Marxist viewpoint, from a scientific viewpoint, from a dialectic viewpoint of why does this exist? What economic base made this cultural work come into existence? And I like to do that on my show. And when I'm thinking about the struggle of women comrades, proletarian women, I think one particular artist comes into mind, and that's the country artist Loretta Lynn. This is her album "Back to the Country," where she has a song on it talking about the pill, which is birth control, which was an interesting topic at the time. Her thing Loretta Lynn had a lot of children. A lot of women are forced to be the primary caretakers, or the labor, the unpaid, unrecognized labor of raising the next group of workers comes down as socially, culturally, and because they're discriminated in the workplace, because they're less likely and discriminated against and make less on the dollar than men, they're forced to do the unpaid labor of taking care of the next generation of workers. When we think about it, who benefits from this unpaid labor? We grow up, we become workers. And to work for our existence, we have to be exploited by the capitalists. So this is necessary labor for our society and is unrecognized. And one of the songs that Loretta Lynn said is called Here in Topeka. And it kind of gets at the disconnect between what I would consider the bourgeois feminist versus the proletarian feminist movement. I'll read a little bit of lyrics from Loretta Lynn. The girls in New York City, they all march for women's lib. And better homes and gardens shows the modern way to live. And the pill may change the world tomorrow. But meanwhile today, here in Topeka, the flies are a-buzzing. The dog is a-barking. The floor needs a scrubbing. One needs a spanking. One needs a hugging. Lord, one is on the way. Oh, gee, I hope it ain't twins again. It kind of gets, I mean, is that a kick at the feminist movement? If you look at the girls in New York City, all march for women live. Now, I think it's a disconnect between the synthetic left not getting out to the masses and not getting to the struggles of the people. Back in Topeka, Kansas, she got was it 5? The song's talking about 4 or 5 kids, and the idea of bringing up those to become workers and functioning adult, and the labor that goes into it, to change the diapers, what have you. And last month, I talked about my struggles as a working class youth, growing up down a mile-long dirt road, 8 folks in a 2-bedroom trailer. And I'm thinking about my mom. How was it for my mom dealing with that situation? Like, if it was hard for me growing up, eight people in a house, I was a kid, I was kind of oblivious. What was the responsibility and the stress for my mom putting in the labor necessary to make us functioning adults to go on to be workers? And that struggle's going on all around us. All around us. Single moms out there, primarily the major statistically single moms, head of households, with the pressure cooker of which is capitalism, tears apart our families and push the pressure on working women, both to provide for their families and to take care of their families. In bourgeois society, they often call this the second shift. And a lot of the feminist movement would like us to think, it's the man's fault. Like it's all, the reason why women oppress, it's men. But in reality, who benefits off the system? It's the capitalist. It's the capitalist that designs society, constructs society in a way, and the ones that take the resources generated by the oppression, by capitalist oppression, by patriarchy, from oppressed nations. These systems of oppression benefit the main capitalists, the capitalist imperialist system. And it's funny because they study this, and in the universities and sociology, they study every aspect of it. They understand how the feeling is, and then they use that instead of using that understanding to dismantle the oppression of women. They use that to say the empire knows more about women's rights. The empire knows more about gay rights. They're way more sophisticated and have a better understanding. So they invade countries in the name of feminism, and they invade countries in the name of gay rights. The U.S. imperialist system will have women politicians talking about, we're going in to invade Afghanistan to free women from the horrible Islamics. Meanwhile, over there to maintain power, they're pouring acid on women's faces from the warlords that the U.S. is supporting, and they're keeping whole regions in poverty. What about the women in the countries taking care of their children, trying to provide for themselves, and they're dealing with imperialism? It's absolutely horrendous and illogical what the women, the capitalist, the synthetic left twists real issues that we deal with and twists them to support the system where this oppression flows from. Maybe to touch a bit on it's absolute hypocrisy. It's just like So I would suggest we make proletarian feminist demands. And one of those would be free childcare for everyone. Free childcare for everyone, for all working mothers. I had a friend that visited Venezuela, in a poor country that's under threat of economic sabotage, has free childcare in the floor room of the factories. And we can't even get this here in the center of the imperial core. That is a proletarian demand, that we need free childcare, because who benefits from us growing up and being raised and becoming, and we replace the workers. We are simply machines to the capitalists. And we're forced to produce ourselves, educate ourselves, come up so we can then work and be exploited for the capitalist system. And one of the gut-wrenching things of this hypocrisy is the fascist, the disgusting racist, at the very least, the disgusting racist politician Trump. One of his lies before he came into power, that he was going to provide free child care. Well, as soon as he got into power, he got rid of that demand. But even this horrible, racist demigod can make a demand and use it to twist people to support him. But we can't have these liberal organizations demand free child care. It's absolutely disgusting. One of the worst things I saw is this absolute hypocrisy of the synthetic left, the elite liberals, who were fighting the good fight against Trump as a fascist. But then when the first attack they get against Trump was they impeached him for not giving weapons to literal neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. So we're going to fight fascism by forcing the so-called fascist to aid and give weapons to fascist groups to attack the people of Russia. The hypocrisy of the synthetic left-backed imperialist empire and the imperialist bloc and NATO is absolutely disgusting. And we cannot depend on sheepdog politicians and professors and the universities to do something about it. We need to get in our own communities and speak out against bigotry, speak out against sexism, speak out against racism. Each one, teach one. Revolutionary practice. From the masses to the masses. Get out of the movement, get to the masses. I need you watching this. I need you to make a contact list. And I need you to think about who you can get involved in the struggles in your community. I want you to think about what you can do. I want you to lead a study group. I want you to come on. I'm doing a study group on the 10th. With Caleb Maupin talking about Einstein's Why Socialism on my channel, Dust James, Anti-Imperialist America, with the comrades David Fox and the comrades Keaton Mansfield from Southern Illinois. I want you to get involved in the Center for Political Innovation. And with that said, it's a good little bit of a intro. I'd like to turn it out to comrades Ariel and Delaney.
Artie, thank you so much. That was a much more stellar introduction than I had anticipated. Well, I would like to begin my presentation this evening, afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in, with a bit of a personal anecdote as a framing device, perhaps, for this document, which I had the misfortune of coming across that just really activated my almonds. So I grew up with a father who was a chief petty officer in the U.S. Coast Guard. He enlisted after losing his job at a Ford auto manufacturing plant in Dayton, Ohio. Having no other prospects, he figured it was the least malign branch that he could sign up with. He then proceeded to serve for 23 years and upon retiring become a maintenance contractor for the Navy and Coast Guard. He doesn't do acquisitions, but he just fixes engines. That's what he loves doing. And my father is not a misogynist by any stretch of the imagination, at least not nearly as much as any other boomer in the military that I've met. He regularly deferred to my mother in terms of like moving couches, and he never once thought that her place was at home, just barefoot in the kitchen. He took pride in the fact that he taught me how to defend myself physically and mentally from violence, both male and female, from a very young age. And in fact, I remember him taking me out for an ice cream sundae when I came home with a note from my teachers stating that they needed a conference because I had stood up to a bully of mine. So I mention this because the cognitive dissonance that I witnessed growing up in my father has always prompted me to ask the question, how and why are you like this? It should be very clear to somebody, especially somebody who's in the armed forces, as we'll get to, that you're serving a system that's ultimately hurting you alongside the rest of your community. And I've found many answers and many explanations to wave this away, stemming from the just world fallacy to confirmation bias. You name it, it's been thrown out there. But what I've come down to is simply the ideology of American exceptionalism and of Western hegemony being the almost divine right of God at this point. And I mention this because this document that I found was published on October 31st, 2020, and it's very spooky indeed. It was published in honor of the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council's resolution on women, peace, and transforming security, which is ever a sinister collection of words if I've heard it. To give a brief on what this resolution was, it is unique at the time. Quote, it constituted a fundamental shift in global thinking about conflict and its aftermath, bringing gender considerations to the fore and paving the way for what has become known as the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. It focused on integrating gender perspectives into security framework. And on the 20th anniversary, NATO asked itself, is this still fit for purpose? It looked at the efficacy of so-called gender advisors and assessed the full implementation of their strategies across headquarters, missions, and operations, and wanted to compile best practices. This, to me, seems to be audacious at best. I'm sure that the rest of the panel would tend to agree, and same with the audience, but to just give a taste of this 60-page document that nobody should have to read, I've selected a few quotes. They wanted the Women, Peace, and Security resolution to reflect how NATO understood itself, with 3 themes standing out. Quote, first, that NATO is not only a military but political alliance, which is clear. Secretary General Stoltenberg suggests that NATO members should use NATO more politically. Issues such as climate change, regulation of cyberspace, new technologies, all issues that affect allied security should be brought to NATO's table. Second, that NATO should take a more global approach, looking beyond the North Atlantic context. The rise of China specifically is framed as a significant challenge for NATO, demanding closer collaboration with partners in Asia and the Pacific. Third, that NATO is not only an alliance for collective security, but a mechanism to compete in a more competitive world. This frames economic and technological competition as aspects of NATO's understanding and security. So the way that this fits in their eyes, is basically a means to confuse about half of the population into literally gunning for policies that detrimentally affect them. They list things such as normalizing gender throughout the forces as well as their operations on the ground in nations that we have imperialized and attempted to liberalize, although like that is generous at best, as we all know. To confuse the populations there and to turn them against each other. And I think that this document really, it highlights the essence of what identity politics has become today, especially in America and the rest of the Anglophone sphere. It serves as a means to an end for the ruling class. Identity politics is based not in material reality or conditions, but in social constructivism, which can be useful when it is based in material reality and material conditions. social constructivism unmoored from that is nothing but a bourgeois narrative sold in overpriced master's degree programs and then distilled down in the culture to make the working class hate itself. And that NATO is championing it is sure sign of that. And to really drive it home, I wanted to just mention their star example of the implementation of this policy. And I won't say too much about it because it makes me frankly sick. They highlight women's service in the IDF as a shining example on a hill that we should all be aiming for. That is the ideal, the IDF, that champion of human rights. And in their own words, they've decided to reorient their women, peace, and security policy towards one that they find to be a little bit more effective, which is an intersectional feminist perspective. Now, intersectionality, as defined by Kimberly Crenshaw, does have a good legal framework. Certainly among the American legal framework, this can be observed in material conditions in reality, right? But to apply one model worldwide, like just a hammer and an anvil, it reeks of exceptionalism. And, well, I'll just mention in their words here. With the increased focus on the importance of understanding intersectional identities and feminist theories, this essay calls for their recognition within the implementation of the UN Security Council's resolution in NATO nations and bodies. Intersectional feminist theory is a critical approach, highlighting how different social identities, such as ethnicity, race, and social class, can impact a person's experiences or their gender. Now, two things really stand out to me here. One, this is the only time that social class is mentioned in the whole 60-page document, and it's the last time as well. They pay lip service to it because it is part of the boilerplate definition, but beyond that, I mean, we all know that they don't want you to pay attention to that pesky fact. And the experience of their gender is another one that really strikes me. You see, by divorcing the feminist struggle from material reality and material conditions, the axis upon which women's oppression has been based, I mean, since before we were Homo sapiens sapiens, even, it serves to just unmoor women from themselves. It drives home the alienation of the modern capitalist state, and it formalizes and totalizes that alienation. The personal is political with this, and what NATO seeks to do here is not just colonize our nations, but apparently our bodies and minds as well. And I believe that it is being aware of these narratives and actively militant against them that will serve to strengthen our resolve against the larger machine as a whole, and to remind us to keep our eyes on the prize. And with that, I would like to turn it over to my friend Ariel here, who has quite a bit to say on some very important bits about NATO itself and the things that comprise it.
So I could probably do a full dissertation specifically in regards to gender in the armed forces, in NATO, in the subject touched on there, but we don't have time for that. I would like to provide more of a holistic perspective, and one that I think is still probably pretty rare, which is leftists in the military. It's a small but pretty vocal contingent, and it's a viewpoint I've come to pretty recently. I'm not new to the military, but found Marxism-Leninism through Delaney here. And I think we can actually really build a lot of solidarity with people in the armed forces. And my reasoning for that is, much as class plays into anything, it plays into the military. So part of the allure for joining is the benefits there, not just the stability of pay, housing, food, but access to medical care through the VA, on-base childcare, education, etc. And class is just as visible in the military as anywhere else. There's a huge divide between enlisted and officers, your captains, majors, etc., because the gateway to being an officer is a college education. But then on the flip side, you'll see people enlisting who grew up in poverty, who said that the first time they were guaranteed to have shoes was in the military. So these are a bunch of people who didn't see another choice in life, who don't even have a concept of what imperialism is. And they're promised all these things and they join up. But some of them come back, whether from deployment or just enjoying the benefits of active duty, and they see the role of imperialism. They'll go overseas and watch their fellow soldiers suffer, or they'll see the things that happen to the local nationals and what we've done in the Middle East. And it can really be a breaking point. It can be eye-opening. And we start to have this realization that these benefits that we enjoy, these aren't things that we should be rewarded with by participating in US imperialism. These aren't things that we should possibly have to die for. If we can have these things, then what's stopping everyone? What's stopping socialized medicine? What's stopping childcare? So I think what we can do, if we're willing, and I know there's a pretty broad divide between leftists and the military. It's really easy when we're condemning imperialism, as we should, to fall into the trap of blaming individual soldiers and say, you're irredeemable because you've participated in this. But if you're willing to set that aside, and if you're willing to have a conversation, which is something that I try to do with my fellow enlisted, they're really receptive to this. There's a large contingent of people who joined for their citizenship because they're Latino. They're people who understand that a better life is possible, and they see the juxtaposition in class and in the military lifestyle versus everyone else. And it's a hard conversation to have when you're not exposed to the military and you don't really know what we do, but it's valuable because even outside of armed revolution, which I don't think very many people want to jump straight to, the army is not just a bunch of door-kicking, tank-driving people. Overwhelmingly, the army is logistics. You have people who know how to make the most out of a lack of supplies. It's cooks, it's mechanics, it's supply people, it's admin. It's comprised of people who know how to get creative, who know how to make things move. So if we're willing to set aside this animosity that's pretty common in the left, there's so many valuable resources, so much experience, and 100% of us are not booed, I promise. We're willing to hear another perspective. You just have to be able to talk to these people in the right way. And you'll find that a surprising number of us are open to this message or are already progressive, communist, etc. We're open to reaching the logical conclusion of our experiences, and that is that there can be no war but class war. And that's all I've got for you folks.
That's I mean that really does it for both of us. That's the Wonder Twins bit.
Thank you, comrades. Ariel and Delaney, that was both well informed and heartfelt talk. That last bit kind of hit me hard. You know, I'm living in the South, and I actually did counter recruitment to the military in high school in a military town as a basis of poor black and brown people shouldn't go and kill poor black and brown people. But I mean, I've come to around on this issue is understanding scientific socialism. As long as the empire has the money and the political power, they will use that against us for our very survival and push us to become pawns of our own enemies. And that was very heartfelt and beautiful. And I would like to see communist comrades reaching out to people, our family members and former coworkers in the military, and having them be part of the movement towards socialism. I guess we'll. Was it Max the sax? Were you about to put some sax on this? All right, go ahead, brother.
Yep. That was a Solidarity song, or Solidarität, it's the lead in German. It was a song sung by workers when they went into like marches and demonstrations where the social democratic class traders often charged and abused them and broke up the demonstrations. And it relates to the upcoming presentation by Justin Simons on NATO and imperialism, how workers, different nationalities, peoples of America need to unite on the basis of class to oppose imperialism, to help out our brothers and sisters abroad in other conflicts in other places, to help out our brothers and sisters in Yemen that are under the bombs that are produced at U.S. military manufacturing plants, to help out our brothers and sisters in Venezuela that are under the daily suffering of our brutal sanctions that we've imposed on that country, to help out all international workers in the struggle against capitalism, fascism, and U.S. imperialism.
Right on, brother, man. A good little musical interlude there. And without further ado, we get to our keynote speaker, the great Justin Simons. Take it away.
Thank you so much. One second, let me pull up my presentation. Fantastic. All right. Can you all see the presentation? Yes? Fantastic. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Wonderful presentations have been had by all. This is really, truly an honor to be here, to be part of this process. I've been involved with the Center for Political Innovation for quite some time, really since its inception. And, we've been doing a lot of great research, and we're always really happy to show what we've got, show what we can present to people, and really engage with the public in a meaningful and tantamount manner. So, today, we're going to be talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, or understanding the dynamics of hegemony, or as I like to say, at the end of NATO, how the undercurrents of progress can alter the course of geopolitics. This presentation was made possible by the support and donations of the general public, and this is a presentation that I hope you all enjoy. So, let's start off with the preamble of the North Atlantic Treaty. The parties to this treaty reaffirm their faith in the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and their desire to live in peace with all peoples and all governments. They are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. They seek to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. They are resolved to unite their efforts for collective defense and for the preservation of peace and security, quote unquote. That is the preamble to the North Atlantic Treaty signed April 4th, 1949, City of Washington, District of Columbia, the capital of the United States of America. This was reiterated again at their 10th anniversary in 1959. Is a poster from that conference. It shows a woman and a wall protecting them of the various nations included in NATO at that time. But of course, there's the content and the context, right? And what exists around this aspect of the North Atlantic Treaty and NATO as an organization. So first, what we're going to be doing is defining what the North Atlantic Treaty represents as a strategic and political entity, illustrating the historical material context of NATO's role in international affairs, and developing requisite concepts for people and institutions to promote models of geopolitical engagement and cooperation beyond NATO. I would like to reiterate that the Center for Political Innovation in no way, shape, or forms, as far as I understand, supports NATO in any representative form, and we very much are opposed to the alliance that has really strangled Europe and parts of the world for a great deal of decades since the middle of the 20th century. We're going to talk a little about its development, why it exists, how it comes to exist, and really what it means, has meant as an organization in the past, and really what it's going to mean in the future. As the world moves towards industrial strategic parity, we're going to find that it's going to be a lot harder to justify organizations like NATO in going forward. And really, new modes of multilateral global development will come forward and institute aspects of change, not just in terms of geopolitics, but economically, socially, and politically as well. I'll also put out a few pictures, of course. In the middle here, we have a very famous photograph of Checkpoint Charlie between East and West Berlin, U.S. Patton tanks versus Soviet T-55s. And, for a long time, NATO being built out of the end of World War II, right? We have these institutions established that manifest themselves and create the dynamics for what we understand the West to be today. So first off, let's ask ourselves, what is NATO? Well, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is an intergovernmental strategic military alliance, including 30 nations around the North Atlantic Ocean, encompassing Europe and North America. The goal of NATO is to enforce the objectives of the North Atlantic Treaty, established in April 1949. The combined military spending of all NATO countries constitutes over 70% of the global total, or roughly 1.1 trillion United States dollars. To put that in perspective, the United States military budget today is somewhere around $750 billion. So, of course, the U.S. makes the lion's share of that total, but still, it is quite an insurmountable number. Despite the defined operational territory as stipulated in the North Atlantic Treaty, the armed forces of NATO countries maintain a presence on every habitable continent on Earth. So, although NATO is typically a European alliance for collective defense, so they say, there are bases of NATO countries all over the planet, including in Oceania, all the way to Africa, South America. It is quite an extensive operation. So, this, of course, begs the question, what is the North Atlantic Treaty? Well, the North Atlantic Treaty is the culmination of diplomatic overtures between several Western European nations and the United States and Canada. It was designed in accordance with the strategic principles of containment. If anyone ever looked at my previous presentation on multilateralism, you know what that is. We can always go over that in the Q&A. But as promoted by the United States in order to prevent the spread of communist aggression, quote unquote. The criteria for membership and expansion is stipulated in the treaty to include all nations in the North Atlantic Mediterranean Sea north of the Tropic of Cancer. So there are criteria of how to become a member of NATO. You have to fall within a certain geographical space. So there's actually a reason why countries like Japan or Australia, they actually can't join NATO because they're not in the geographical area NATO is supposed to cover. That's supposed to give an air of legitimacy, even though most of those nations are major non-NATO allies. So Let's talk about the historical material context of NATO and understanding the developmental process of Atlanticism and how it really shaped the creation of the West. Here we have a photograph, a very famous photograph of Dresden in 1945. Dresden is a city which eventually fell in eastern Germany, and it was firebombed by the British during World War II. It's one of the deadliest aspects of strategic bombing during the war. And frankly, it would go on to underpin this idea of destructive power in Europe, especially with the development of atomic and later thermonuclear weapons. These aspects of strategic parity become a key motivator for the development of the North Atlantic Treaty. So first, let us define Atlanticism. So Atlanticism is the advocation of or support for cooperation among European North American nations regarding political, economic, and defense issues. Based on the perceived notion of commonality and shared values regarding liberal thought, individualism, and property, Atlanticism came into being shortly after the Second World War, based on the newly established order that was developed after the defeat of fascism in Western Europe. This idea would serve as the basis for the construction of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the acquisition of international partners to combat the rising tides of Marxist-Leninist political movements throughout Europe and potentially around the globe. Here we have a famous photograph as well. Whatever the weather, we only reach welfare together. And of course, it has the United States as the guiding fin for the windmill. There was a huge propaganda effort to promote this idea of Atlanticism, and the manifestations of which we're still dealing with today. And of course, there's Atlanticism and the formalization of the West. So, though the concept of Western civilization has existed since the late 19th century, the formalization of institutions developed for the preservation of the quote-unquote the West would be established toward the end of the Second World War. Atlanticism helped lay the fundamental foundation methodology toward moving the West from ideal to institution, establishing institutions for geopolitical cooperation and strategic initiative, at least superficially, on the notion of common virtues as prescribed by this theory. Conceptually, however, the idea of what constitutes the West is not a constant, as ideas and perceptions that actuate the mechanizations of what would be considered Western civilization has changed dramatically depending on the hegemonic interests manifesting this ideal. In short, the idea of Western civilization is an idealistic one and not a materialistic endeavor. So, if you're going to take one thing away from this presentation, it is that the idea of the West and Western civilization is not a constant. It does not have a defined role. It is very arbitrary. It has changed over time. And we've seen this throughout history, right? When we look at the late 19th century, we are developing a concept of the West with the aspects of new imperialism, these concepts of quote unquote the white man's burden. These issues start coming to play as Europe begins to essentially annex large sections of the planet. And what ends up being established, what European nations are establishing, is this idea of Western civilization. Now, this, of course, is a newer concept, right? The West idea of Western civilization is something that really comes out of the Industrial Revolution, and really doesn't exist in, say, the 18th century, right? Where you have the British and French empires, and they're so dramatically different that you really can't imagine them being part of the same power block. And of course, we had concepts such as Christendom, right, prior to this. But these concepts, again, are also arbitrary and do not manifest any form of uniform goal, because we see in history, in European history, various groups of theologians fighting each other in the wars of religion, etc. So the idea of a cultural basis for a military alliance is a tenuous one, at the very least, and one with disastrous results in actuality. And when we engage in this concept of the West, we're not perpetuating an idea that is rooted in any sort of scientific matter, but really is sort of an arbitrary foundational point to draw from to inspire people to do things that normally wouldn't do. And of course, who is in the West, right? And how the West manifests itself, that has changed over time. So, during the the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, when the Eight Nation Alliance came to intervene in China. You had various nations of Europe. You also had Japan involved, and they were considered part of the defenders of Western civilization, and they were going in to beat the Boxers and fight the Qing dynasty. In World War I, Germany and Austria-Hungary, nations in the center of Europe, they decided they would somehow got ejected from the West, even though they're literally in the middle of Europe. And now all of a sudden they are the greatest threats to Western civilization. Russia at the end of World War I all of a sudden wasn't in the West anymore because the Bolsheviks took over. And even today, many nations of the former Warsaw Pact are now members of NATO and part of the West. Prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the fall of many Eastern Marxist-Leninist governments, they weren't part of the West during that period of time, but now they are. And so the notion of the West has changed dramatically over time. And if you're going to take any aspect of this from this presentation, I would recommend knowing that the West is not a monolithic power block. There is no defining feature of the West other than the hegemonic nature that has been used to mechanize it. And that's sort of the thing we're going for. But of course, there's also Atlanticism versus multilateralism, right? So though in essence, Atlanticism is in fact a form of multilateral relationship, it does not extend beyond the defining traits of hegemony. Atlanticism is generally conflicting with the multilateralist conceptions of global relations because it confines the essential philosophies of virtue within the worldview of the West. The notion of defending the ideas of Western civilization can be connected to this belief of confined virtue and therefore draws a line between the perception of the West and any conflicting ideologies or observations. So in other words, in this modern sense, the idea of the West is being used as a means to draw a line in the sand between us and the rest of the world, us and them. And, even though socialism was developed by Karl Marx in Germany, that's also an alien idea. It's not part of the West, right? We reject it outright. So there's no objectivity, right? There's no materialist analysis in this concept. It's purely an idealistic form that only promotes the concepts of hegemony. And now the West is in essence the guardians of virtue and righteousness in terms of policy and ideas and human nature. And so that's why countries outside the West, countries who we consider outside the West, countries like Russia, right, even though it's in Europe, countries like China and India, right, they're definitely not in Europe, but they're not considered part of that Western milieu. Maybe India sometimes is, it's not really. And the idea is that these countries, they are outside this periphery, they are alien, they are not part of this exclusive clique. And the reality is that this is really a methodology that is archaic, that is used to essentially divide the world between us and them, and has been used to manifest things like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to defend an ideal, right? It's not defending a materialist concept. It is defending an idealistic concept that it actually isn't shared amongst all its members. And that's kind of the general point, right? The idea of the West is not there to exist foundationally as a material construct. It is there as an ideal that needs to be strived and protected for, despite the fact that it really is an arbitrary thing to begin with. So we're going to look at a little video here. It's called NATO as presented by the United States. It's a program known as the Big Picture. It came out between the 1950s and late 1970s. And it was a program provided by the U.S. Army. I like to note that the views and opinions expressed in this newsreel is not the views and opinions of the Center for Political Innovation, do not represent the views and opinions of the Center for Political Innovation, and they are inherently anti-communist. So I just want to warn you ahead of time that this is an anti-communist video. Allow me to show this video.
This is The Big Picture, an official television report of the United States Army, produced for the armed forces and the American people. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Master Sergeant Stuart Quaid.
Throughout history, nations have sought through treaties and alliances with other nations to maintain their security and remain free from attack. But not until the 20th century did the concept of national security become worldwide in its scope. World Wars I and II and the Korean conflict proved beyond any doubt that when one free nation anywhere is threatened by aggression, the safety of all free nations is ultimately at stake. Today, the United States, keenly aware of its strategic role as a leader in the free world, has allied itself with other nations, dedicated to the preservation of peace and the welfare of mankind. Our big picture cameras today focus on one of the most important of these alliances. As our guest narrator, the distinguished news analyst Edward R. Murrow tells the story behind NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
This is the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, headquarters of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. To this building come ministers from 15 nations of the Atlantic community. They speak different languages, have different cultural backgrounds. The countries they represent vary in size from very small to very large. But here, all distinctions fade. All the languages become one, the language of hope. Why do these nations ally themselves with NATO? Why NATO? And why must this organization continue to exist? Let's go back to the beginning of the story. In May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. This had been the price of Europe's unpreparedness. But in May 1945, our hard-won peace seemed at last secure. A few days before, Allied forces from the West had joined hands with the Russians from the East. Their statesmen had met cordially at Yalta and at Potsdam. They had agreed that the countries they had occupied should be truly liberated and that freely elected governments should be set up as soon as possible. Within a few months, the countries of Western Europe and Scandinavia were free and independent. But for the countries occupied by Russia, Stalin had other ideas. Throughout Eastern Europe, elections were held. But the Russians had placed the communists in key government positions and in the secret police. Within a short time, the non-communist leaders had been liquidated. Russia had swallowed up 8 European countries without firing another shot, other than those of the execution squads. Great Britain and the United States protested that these countries had been coerced by threat of force and that Russia had broken her treaty. But Russia ignored the protests. Stalin knew that the greater part of the Allied forces had gone home, leaving their arms to rust in the fields of Europe. In the West, men were impatient to be demobilized. The war was finished, and they had other work to do. But the Russians had not demobilized. They retained overwhelmingly the largest force in Europe. The small group of men in the Kremlin had long ago dedicated themselves to the spreading of communism by all possible means. They knew that an army can be used not only to fight wars, it can be used to intimidate. To the south lay 2 more possible victims, Greece and Turkey. In March 1946, the Russians denounced their treaty with Turkey. They offered to renew it if the Turks would give up part of their territory and allow the Russians to establish bases controlling the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. The Turks refused. In Greece, the communists had already started civil war. Russia was sending arms to them through the neighboring satellite states to bring bitterness, despair, and death to the Greek people. If Greece and perhaps Turkey were not also to be swallowed up, help had to come from the West. At this crisis, in March 1947, President Truman asked the United States Congress in an historic speech to modify its traditional policy of neutrality.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
Only Czechoslovakia, of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, had thus far preserved some independence. After the war, the Russians had had to reckon with the popularity of President Beneš and his Foreign Secretary Jan Masaryk. They were liberal-minded men who believed that it was possible to be friends with the communists without succumbing to them. But to the communists, gentleness is weakness. And a country prepared to compromise is a weak country. The machinery for taking over countries had now been perfected. The coup in Czechoslovakia was swifter and more efficient than ever before. Within a week, all opposition was suppressed. There was another victory to celebrate, another victory over freedom. President Beneš was allowed to retire to his country house. He died there, a broken-hearted man. One morning, on the stones under his bedroom window, Jan Masaryk was found dead. Truth had ceased to come out of Czechoslovakia. The nations of Western Europe were forced at last to realize that they must combine to protect their own liberty. 3 weeks after the fall of Czechoslovakia in March 1948, the Brussels Treaty was signed by Great Britain, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. These 5 countries pledged themselves to help each other in case of attack. But Western Union, as it was called, was not strong enough to deter the men of the Kremlin from their policy of aggression. In August, Russia decided, on a trumped-up excuse, to cut off the Allied sectors of Berlin from the West. Trains, barges, and road transports were stopped. The United States, Britain, and France were responsible for 2.5 million people in Berlin. Now their food and fuel for their homes and factories could no longer be brought to them overland, unless with armed protection and at the risk of war. It seemed that they, too, must be at the mercy of the Russians. But the governments of the West did not give way. The life of Western Berlin was maintained by air on a scale never before contemplated in history. Each day, the prestige of the West rose. After 9 anxious months, the Russians lifted the blockade. The policy of standing firm had been vindicated. The Russian cynical blockade of Berlin had brought Europe to the brink of war. It was at last clear that only a strong defensive alliance could deter them from further adventures. On 4 April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed by Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, Portugal, the United Kingdom, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO. They were sworn to stand together against aggression. An attack against one would be an attack against all. Although the treaty was carefully designed to keep within the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter, Soviet Russia claimed that it was an attempt at world domination. But while still accusing NATO nations of intended aggression, they themselves, frustrated in Europe, turned to the Far East, to Korea. The United Nations sent an army to Korea under a single command to hold the aggressors at bay. It was almost too late. The lesson for Europe was clear.
The music always gets me. Have the bassoons and all the deep musical instruments. As you can see, illustrating the point I made earlier, we're talking about the West and the idea that Western civilization, these ideas of freedom, they don't just call it Western ideas, they call it freedom, like literally in a literal sense. These ideas are under threat by communist aggression. And of course, they never refer to the Soviet Union as the Soviets. They always refer to them as the Russians because, you know, lo and behold, we can't assume that they have a democratic system of government. It has to be run by the Russians. These aspects are what they played out for years and years and years. And, you know, it's in a world where we don't have access to other forms of media or ideas or concepts, right? This really is the only method you're getting information from, either through newsreels at your local theater, from the radio, and of course, a handful of TV channels and, you know, the dawn of television. There really is no way of confirming that any of this is true. So there are large aspects that are going on and sets of manipulation that are at play that are trying to drum up this idea that the West is a real concept. It is something that does exist and has defined values, even though by state, those values are in fact different. And the reality is that they've drawn a line in the sand, and this is their line in the sand. This is their way of showing the world this needs to exist because of these existential threats to quote unquote Western civilization. We are going to skip ahead just a little bit because it is a long video, and we'll end sometime. We'll end right after this. We'll go on to the next section of our presentation. So.
1/3 to Norstadt. But because an ideal is stronger than any individual, though the faces changed, the work drove on. It was in the field that results counted, and it was in the field that they were realized. At each successive meeting, the ministers of the NATO nations could report further progress and a steadily growing unity within the alliance. Thanks to the cooperation of 15 nations, what had once been merely a document with signatures was becoming the Atlantic Alliance in fact and in strength. Steadily, the clouds of fear that had hung over Europe were lifting. Vigilance and readiness were paying off. Surprise and disunity amongst his victims, the strongest weapons in any aggressor's arsenal, were no longer available to him. Each day found NATO stronger, more prepared, and more confident. Though the strength was not yet what NATO would have liked, already a would-be aggressor must count the cost. For now, should attack come, the Atlantic allies could call in their defense not only upon conventional weapons, but also upon a whole new arsenal. Now, to a would-be aggressor, the cost loomed large indeed. Now they would need far more than shoes. NATO's strength was such that by 1955, West could meet East at Geneva on equal terms. Though any promise of real relief was soon to be dashed. This was Hungary in 1956. This was Budapest. Exhausted by Soviet domination and denied their freedom, the people of Hungary rose in protest. But without allies, heroism is not enough. This could be us. This is why NATO had to exist. The members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, gravely concerned over increasing Soviet military power, gathered in Paris in December 1957 for a crucial conference. From the United States came President Dwight David Eisenhower, whose presence at this critical time gave the nations of Western Europe new hope. For Ike, this was a homecoming. At the headquarters of SHAPE, the military arm of NATO, located outside Paris, the former commander of the North Atlantic Military Forces, now president of one of NATO's most powerful member nations, declared his mission before the large crowd which had gathered to greet him.
Frankly, I came out here because of a special kind of sickness, one that afflicts the aged and the young, homesickness. I was homesick to see this home that was built for Secker and his staff, an agency of NATO. This home was built by a great number of nations to be the headquarters of that military shield that must always belong to NATO so long as there is any menace to the freedom of the Western nations.
And now, once more, at the Palais de Chaillot, which housed the Western world's hopes for peace, they gathered. The men of goodwill who bore their people's mandate for freedom. This was the first NATO meeting attended by the heads of the 15 member states. This was a summit conference calling for highest level consultation. Basically, two critical tasks had to be accomplished: to shore up NATO and to counteract an intensified Soviet propaganda offensive. A major interest of the United States in the NATO meeting was the question of integrating into Western defense the intermediate-range ballistic missile as a deterrent to the Soviets, whose long-range missile had for the moment thrown a shadow over the world. The 15 heads of states attending this vital NATO meeting represented 450 million people, whose lands covered a total of almost 8 million square miles of the Earth's surface. Differences were to be expected, but on one point there was complete agreement: the core of the NATO partnership. An attack against one was an attack against all. In order to live in peace together, all were resolved to defend themselves together if necessary. Many of the nations of Western Europe felt that political, not military action was the answer to the latest Soviet threats. Others believed that NATO should be interested as well in broader problems and looked to the United States for support of their national positions. President Eisenhower's words were the high point of the conference. There was no mistaking Ike's sincerity and determination as he spoke.
We have demonstrated a will for the spreading of the blessings of liberty. Within the last 15 years, our nations have freely granted political independence to 20 countries with populations totaling 800 million people. Within our societies, we manifest so that all can see the good fruits of freedom. Those fruits do not consist of materialistic monuments, which despots have always been able to exhibit. They consist of providing the simple things all men want. The opportunity to think and worship as their conscience and reason dictate. To live in their homes without fear. To draw together in the intimacies of family life. To work in congenial tasks of their own choice. And to enjoy the fruits of their labor. These are the most precious manifestations of freedom. And we have the collective power to defend and spread that freedom. Freedom has not failed us. Surely we shall not fail freedom.
All right. Hope you all enjoyed that video as much as I did. Let me go back to my presentation. All right. All right. So, NATO in practice. So NATO was formed in general as a united bulwark against the expansion and support of Marxist-Leninist political movements in Europe. Founding members of NATO saw the increased industrial and strategic capabilities of the Soviet Union as a threat against capitalist reconstruction post-Second World War. And NATO promoted membership and supported anti-communist entities in Europe, regardless of the democratic nature of said entity. So, again, NATO exists as a tool in which to defend capitalism, right? It's designed to defend the institutions that are being built to reconstruct a new world order post-World War II. And I talked about this in my previous presentation, but I'll allude on this again. This idea of rebuilding capitalism, because prior to World War II, there really were dynamic aspects of the market that were in a very real sense free, right? They were not subject to a set of international rules and collaborations. They were sort of free form. And that led to a lot of things. Of course, it led to the Great Depression of 1929, but it also revealed the threats in which that can arise from capitalism, right? And from the detrimental aspects of capitalism, right? We have the rise of fascism as a result, and of course, World War II. And these aspects sort of play into the role of what caused that conflict. Going beyond World War II, there becomes a need to sort of reshape the world and the global economy in a way that is more structured and is in a way that does have long-term institutional ramifications going into the 21st century. So let's talk about capitalist reconstruction and post-Second World War. So the United States provided enormous economic and material aid via the European Recovery Program, otherwise known as the Marshall Plan. There was the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. It secured the development of international institutions to structure the new period of U.S.-centric global economic activity, including the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, later becoming the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and of course the World Bank. Acceptance of this economic aid, and in some cases participation within these new structures of global economic activity, mandated a degree of strategic cooperation. The resulting developments, particularly for Europe, meant a general adherence to U.S. foreign policy and economic interest in the geopolitical period of the Cold War in exchange for fiscal access and regional security. So, like I mentioned in my previous presentation about multilateralism, the United States at the end of World War II owned about 52% of all the wealth on planet Earth. That's not an exaggeration. It's a real thing. They owned about half of the world's wealth. And at the end of World War II, with Europe being basically destroyed as a result, there was no system of international marketplace that could be established because these nations were just simply going to come out of the woodwork from on their own. They need some sort of material and financial support in order to do that. And so they established the Marshall Plan, and that sort of sets the basis for the reconstruction of Europe and really the reconstruction of global capitalism, right? Because you can't really have capitalism without a global market and other industrialized markets to engage with. So they essentially had to bite the bullet and do this. But of course, there's caveats, right? And there has to be systems and structures in place to kind of manage the global economy going forward. And so with the Bretton Woods Conference, they do establish new systems of authority, systems of financial and fiscal manifestations that allow the United States really a commanding say in global economic development, really up until the 21st century. And of course, aspects of these elements of U.S. control do start to peter off towards the end of the 20th century. We have the gold standard crisis in the 70s, the oil crisis in the 70s, and these aspects also play into this matter. But you notice a lot of countries who did receive Marshall aid assistance are countries that also have a strategic mandate to support ideas like NATO, right? Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Soviet Union, who 2/3 of its nation was destroyed by World War II, they did not receive a dime of Marshall Plan aid. And there's a reason for that, and it's because the states in the quote-unquote communist bloc, they're not on board with this U.S. global economic plan. They can't be, and so they're excluded from this, right? They're not part of the West as the United States is defining it. And this plays a major role in the developmental structure of what would become NATO, and really sort of obligates a lot of nations in Western Europe to sort of become part of the U.S. strategic influential structures, including NATO. But then there's also the military-industrial complex and STANAG. So after the Second World War, the military-industrial complex in the United States had come to wield an incredible amount of economic and political power. It was clear that future political decisions regarding both domestic enterprise and foreign policy would be influenced by the military-industrial complex going forward. With the continued reconstruction of Europe came the notion of logistical interoperability. During the war, various nations operated a wide range of military equipment, much of it utilizing different components and not suitable for a multinational force as envisioned under NATO. The concept of STANAG, or brevity for Standardization Agreement, would stipulate that all member nations of NATO would utilize various material components that would be interchangeable. Though this made sense logistically, it was a policy critically supported by the interests of the military-industrial complex, seeking to establish a captive market for U.S. arms and munitions. So, at the end of World War II, you have various allied nations. They all have their varying issues of equipment, right? And the Commonwealth with the British Empire, they have their own set of equipment. The United States has its own set of, and its allies have its own set of equipment. The Soviet Union has its own thing. And a lot of other allies who were involved, who maybe weren't major Western allies, but were allies, had brought their own equipment as well to Europe to fight in the war. And this sort of creates a logistical nightmare. And because everyone's using a different rifle, everyone's using a different cartridge, different tires on the car, different components to fix the engines. And a long story short, if another war like World War II were to break out, the worry was that, well, how would we be able to compete against the Soviet Union's 179 uniformly armed divisions with the armed divisions of the various 15 nations of NATO at the time. So the idea was, well, we need to create some sort of economic standard and some sort of industrial standard for which all of our equipment will be built to that standard. And the idea was that, especially in America, who had basically came out on top and untouched by the war, this is a great opportunity to basically have the United States supply all the weapons for NATO. At least in their mind, this is how this would operate. Unfortunately for them, this is actually not how things played out. And as we'll see, we have 3 case studies we're going to go over real quick regarding various aspects of STANAG and why STANAG came to fruition, but not in the way the U.S. really intended. Because in a capitalist society, even though there are aspects of manipulative economic policy, there's also competition to a degree in terms of nations kind of fighting back with their own industries and their own weapons ideas and their own concepts. And so you start having competing ideas, and it kind of comes to fruition in the mid 20th century as new ideas are brought to the fore. So in NATO, of course, there's three standardized small arms cartridges. On the right, we have the 7.62 by 51 millimeter full-size rifle cartridge, the NATO cartridge, used by large battle rifles. In the middle, we have the intermediate cartridge, the 5.56 by 45 millimeter intermediate rifle cartridge, and of course, NATO's 9 by 19 Parabellum pistol cartridge. In the 80s, they went so far as to kind of develop a standardized magazine. So NATO's Stanag rifle magazines are now a thing, and their interchangeable feed magazines became a priority for weapon interoperability. And the idea was that, well, if you're an allied army and your weapon runs out of ammunition, but you run into troops from another nation in NATO, well, they could simply hand you their magazines full of the same ammunition, and you could just use their ammunition from their magazines. There would no need to change, or no need to find another weapon. And this was a really inventive idea, because it basically meant that all of NATO had access to all the nations of NATO had access to the same pool of ammunition and ammunition magazines. But in our first case study, we noticed that the idea of America dominating small arms production through the military industrial complex doesn't quite come into the foray. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but long story short, during World War II, there was a study being done as to what distances combat were taking place against the Germans. And it was determined that most Allied combat in Europe took place within 300 and 600 meters. And the Soviet Union, who had been fighting in the Eastern Front, and literally the bloodiest front of the war, had come to this conclusion pretty quickly, and they were developing different weapons to meet this demand. And what the Soviets came up with was, well, they have a weapon that feeds this intermediate cartridge, the 7.62 by 39 millimeter Soviet, and they simply said, well, this is perfect. We can adopt it to new weapons, because there's no reason to have a Mosin Nagant with a full 5 battle rifle cartridge, designed to shoot targets over 1,000 meters away, when your target, using automatic weapons, is within 600 to 300 meters. There's no reason for that. So they developed the SKS and later developed the AK-47 as their answer to this problem, because it makes a lot more sense to have a weapon that's accurate and has automatic capabilities. The Germans also had their own idea of this, and they came to the same conclusion. So they took their 8 millimeter Mauser cartridge, they chopped it in half, developed the 7.92 by 33 millimeter Kurz cartridge, and that would be used on the Sturmgewehr Model 44, which is Germany's assault rifle. And even the British, who had been fighting the Germans for the longest time, since 1939, they had also came to the same conclusion, although they did not want to change their manufacturing methods in the middle of the war. So they really waited towards the end to kind of come up with this new idea. But they had the idea of a 280 British cartridge, which is an intermediate British cartridge, and they even developed two new weapons to fire this cartridge. One was the EM2, which is a bullpup design. The other one was a Anglo-Belgian collaboration with exiled engineers from Fabrique Nationale, who were working for the British in England for the Allied war effort. And they had basically built this weapon called the FAL, and it would fire this intermediate cartridge. And it was going to, with the FAL and the EM2 were competing to be the assault rifle of NATO, because when the United States, announced this concept of NATO, and they announced this concept of standardization, all the nations of Europe were very much on board with this, because it finally meant that they would all have kind of a collective pool to draw from. R&D is expensive. Why would we have to invest in our own? Why would Belgium and the Netherlands invest in their own military equipment when they could simply just get that from the market and save, however much money and material they needed necessary? So, but people had different ideas of what this would mean. The United States, who had fought the war from 1941 to 45, and had fought, a pretty simplistic conflict, but still, bore the brunt in the Western Front, and from 44 onwards. The United States was the only nation that operated a standard issue semi-automatic rifle, the M1 Garand, for the entire duration of the war. And so America's conclusion was, well, yeah, this research is important, but the reality is that we don't really need a rifle that has a smaller cartridge because we want the capabilities of the 1,000-meter range, but we just have to make it more user-friendly for automatic fire. And so they came up with this new cartridge, the 7.62 millimeter NATO, and a new rifle, the M14, which is basically an M1 Garand with a magazine attached to it with automatic fire capability. And this was going to be the rifle of all the NATO nations, or at least in the minds of the United States. The problem was that the Ordnance Department couldn't get their act together, and it basically took 15 years, from 1944 to 1959, to figure out a way to put a magazine on an M1 Garand and figure the tubing system to make it an automatic rifle. So basically, over a decade of time was spent trying to figure what should have been a simplistic process into an actual weapon and put into service and all these things. Meanwhile, the European nations, particularly Britain, had already been developing weapons to replace the Lee Enfield. And so, long and behold, there was a debate between the British government and the government of the United States whether or not we're going to develop weapons on this intermediate cartridge concept, the same way the Germans had and the same way the Soviets are doing. And long story short, Churchill, having come to government in the mid-50s, essentially saying, well, I don't really want to make America angry. We sort of want to go along with this transatlanticist idea. We really can't argue with them. So we're just going to adopt the American cartridge and then refit all of our weapons to fire this cartridge. Well, the M2 couldn't do that. The FAL could, and so they basically built the FAL rifle that would become the NATO standard rifle, essentially, for much of its history. In fact, over 90 nations would come to adopt the FAL rifle, and it would come to be known as the right arm of the free world. And the battle rifle was born. And the battle rifle concept, a great idea on paper, not a super great idea in actuality, because if anyone knows anything about history, they would know that by the late 80s, all these weapons would be replaced with assault rifles, in particular the M14 with the United States M16. And that's essentially one of the key, this is the first case study we're talking about STANAG and ammunition and how that affected small arms development. And other countries who had their own industries were like, well, why should we wait for the United States to finally churn out this gun when we can make our own guns? And basically, America dropped the ball. They lost an opportunity to supply all of NATO with all American guns. And instead, the European nations actually became the ones who developed the most ubiquitous weapons. And even the M14, as great a gun as that is, was only really in service with the United States during this period, and was really never sold to anyone. It was only given to other countries as aid. So, oh well. Our next case study is regarding the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, against the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. So Robert McNamara, those of you who don't know, he was the Secretary of Defense of the United States from about 1961 to 68. He was our longest serving Secretary of Defense, and he served two administrations, the Kennedy and Johnson administration. Robert McNamara, often referred to as the whiz kid for his mathematical prowess, sought to commodify the armed forces of the United States through consolidation policies that sought to put the military-industrial complex as a direct and integrated source for all procurement. This was to be accomplished under the auspices of cost-saving measures, shortening lengthy state-directed research and development processes by simply putting the suppliers in-house and providing them direct access to political and strategic interests to further disseminate products and services. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department didn't like that. They were headed by a clique of professional officers and didn't want, quote-unquote, businessmen and bureaucrats determining the efficacies of logistics and supplies in the Army. Among the many battles of the Kennedy and later Johnson administrations was the ongoing struggle between corporate interests and the personalities of the U.S. Army. In the end, as the Vietnam War continued to escalate under McNamara's purview, the financial interests of Wall Street would win out over the professional soldiers, gutting the Ordnance Department and essentially placing it under the control of vested financial interests. So, prior to the Vietnam War, the Ordnance Department of the U.S. Army and a lot of the procurement departments of the Department of Defense in the United States, they were all headed by personalities, generals who served in World War II and you don't really question them. McNamara was also an officer in the U.S. Army Air Force during World War II. Firebombing Japan is his idea. long story short, Strategic Air Command was his idea to implement. And essentially, Robert McNamara came up with calculations of how to basically bomb countries into submission, which is why when he left the Army in World War II, after World War II, he joined the Ford Motor Company and made the Ford Motor Company probably one of the most efficient companies in the United States in the mid to late 1950s. And by 1960, Robert McNamara became the president of the Ford Motor Company, the first non-family member of the Ford family to be president of the Ford Motor Company. And he actually basically came to the conclusion that, all these things need to be overhauled. Perhaps we should start outsourcing labor. These are a lot of ideas from McNamara's time. He was only the president of the Ford Motor Company for about a year before a guy named John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who just got elected president of the United States, asked him to be Secretary of Defense. And McNamara decided, well, what a jolly job that is. He quit being president of the Ford Motor Company and became the Secretary of Defense of the United States. And he basically went to work combating the personalities of the armed forces who really had the best interest of the soldier in mind. McNamara, being a corporate guy, really had the interest of his shareholders in mind, and went to work essentially dismantling the rigid structures of the Army and Navy and Air Force procurement departments, and trying to basically move these corporate entities in-house, making sure that they have direct access to all these research and ideas and all these personalities, so that when new products and ideas and services came out, the military would be the first ones on the scene. They'll get it. And the idea was that it's supposed to be a cost-saving measure, right? Because you're not having state entities constantly review all these products. They're simply just accepting them for trial. So it's great if you're a Wall Street banker. It's not so great if you're a soldier and have to go through this whole monotonous process. That being said, as the Vietnam War raged, there was a degree of expediency needed to supply troops in Vietnam, and the Army Ordnance Department, which basically takes years and years and years and years to qualify certain equipment and weapons for production, that's taking too long, and it's very expensive. The United States not only has troops in Vietnam, they got all the troops in NATO and Europe, and they have to man the Strategic Air Command and all these nuclear weapons. So clearly, this is not working out. And basically, McNamara took his case to Congress, and he won. Lyndon B. Johnson was in full agreement. He was like, yes, we need to do this because we simply don't have the time and effort to waste on bombastic generals. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was pretty evident whose side the American public was on. So, Robert McNamara basically tore down the last barriers between the military procurement departments of the Defense Department and various agencies to allow corporate interests to essentially take over. And then it's our final case study for the military-industrial complex, the Lockheed bribery scandal. So between the late 1950s and mid-1970s, the Lockheed Corporation, predecessor to today's Lockheed Martin, had bribed NATO and NATO-aligned countries into purchasing several airframes. One of the key products Lockheed was trying to push was the F-104 Starfighter, as pictured here. The aircraft excelled as a supersonic interceptor, but was not suited for other combat roles, as had been advertised by Lockheed. Furthermore, designs from competing U.S. and European firms were far more capable for a wider range of mission profiles. Grumman had come up with this aircraft called the T-11. The F became the F-11, and it was supposed to be really a much better plane, the F-104, but Lockheed, who had more money, actually bribed their way to beating out the competition, despite Grumman having a better plane. And of course, Dassault Mirage in France had developed the Dassault Mirage airframes in France, and the United States having more money, Lockheed having more money, they were simply able to bribe European officials from buying French airplanes and preferably buying this Lockheed American-built plane. Lockheed had paid about $22 million worth in bribes, roughly $196 million US in today's money, to persuade foreign procurement departments and officials into adopting their airplane. In the end, Lockheed sold thousands, and I mean thousands, of F-104 airframes to a number of countries, citing their commercial success as the deal of the century, quote unquote, as they raved in the Wall Street Journal. Eric Hartmann, a former Nazi-era Luftwaffe fighter ace, who had been brought on to aid in the reconstruction of the West German Bundeswehr Luftwaffe, after careful examination, he deemed the F-104 to be unsuitable for combat service. And of course, he was forced to retire due to his opposition to the airframe's adoption. So, again, another aspect of U.S. economic meddling in foreign affairs, even in European affairs, the idea that military-industrial complex is going to use the Stanag sort of concept to kind of grind their way into the European market, and it worked to varying degrees. And this not only produced issues domestically, but issues abroad as well. Issues that, you know, the military-industrial complex is still kind of reaving from today. So, but not every nation in NATO was okay with all of this. So the French withdrawal from NATO's command structure in 1966. During the presidency of Charles de Gaulle, France had been relegated to a secondary political role in the US-dominated structure of NATO. The United Kingdom, with its cross-Atlantic special relationship, and having been mostly unoccupied during the Second World War, had been able to win a greater role in managing the strategic and political affairs of the alliance. De Gaulle, fearing France's peripheral sway in the NATO alliance, had made overtures to the UK and the US, including a memorandum sent to US President Dwight Eisenhower. The memorandum had basically suggested a withdrawal of France from NATO's overall integrated strategic command and an end to Stanag interoperability if NATO's overall command structure was not altered to include a triumvirate, a leadership organization, where France, the United States, and the United Kingdom shared power as equal partners, including overall political decisions and strategic planning within the alliance. After years of lobbying, de Gaulle found the opposition from the United States and the UK to be surprisingly stiff. He then concluded that France really had no place in the alliance, in which it had very little say. And in 1966, Charles de Gaulle notified NATO that France will be leaving their command structure and requested that all foreign troops were to leave French territory by the end of 1967. France would technically remain in the alliance due to a series of legal clauses, but would operate as an independent force outside of NATO's command structure. Their withdrawal forced the closure of all US and allied bases in the country and the removal of thousands of NATO personnel. France would not fully reintegrate back into NATO until 2009. Some nations were not okay with the US being in control all the time, and some nations did in fact have the power to leave. A nation like France, for example, being a key Western power, member of the UN Security Council, clearly had the authority to say, listen, we're not going to do this. And they walked away, and they withdrew all their ships and their planes, and they forced, thousands and thousands of U.S. and allied personnel out of the country. They closed all their bases and denied use of airspace and base space to U.S. Air Force aircraft fighting the Cold War. So it was quite the monumentous occasion. And, in the height of the 1960s, this is something that really irked the U.S. in a pretty serious way. There are, of course, also the challenges to U.S. hegemony in Europe. The turmoil created by the U.S.-led war in Vietnam established an ever more militant anti-war movement. Political tensions between the U.S. and its European allies were at an all-time high, as strategic decisions often did not seem to acknowledge the defensive outlook of individual members. Aside from their contribution to U.S. strategic outlook, new ideas brought about by the changing nature of global affairs brought countless individuals from all walks of life embracing an anti-imperialist outlook. Massive anti-NATO demonstrations and public pressure and protests were threatening the continued existence of the alliance. Measures were taken by various intelligence agencies and political actors to prevent the collapse of NATO and the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Europe. Right here, we have a photograph of students in May 1967 in Paris who were involved in a massive student uprising. And one of their demands was an end to NATO and the removal of U.S. troops from Europe. So it kind of goes on to tout these ideas. And in the late 60s and early 70s, which is an extraordinarily militant time for the global left as a whole, really saw the tide turn against the U.S. strategy of containment and the idea set forth as a result of their meddling in foreign countries' affairs. This leads us to, of course, the Helsinki Accords in 1975. After a devastating loss in Vietnam for the United States and the increasing toll of expense in the Soviet Union, it was clear that the Cold War was becoming an unsustainable situation. The U.S. strategy of containment was simply unattainable by the measures as had been outlined since the end of the Second World War. An agreement had to be reached in order to relinquish the ever-increasing burden both East and West. The U.S. began a series of measures towards rapprochement and realignment in their global strategy. It was evident that international socialism was here to stay, and initiatives needed to be taken in order to develop some sort of working relationship, if not a tenuous one. The Helsinki Accords were the culmination of a series of agreements between members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Warsaw Pact in their efforts toward de-escalation. The Accords would see the establishment of territorial acknowledgements in Eastern Europe and the full recognition of Marxist-Leninist governments within the quote-unquote communist bloc. It would seek to preserve the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Eastern Europe against the workings of NATO. The Helsinki Accords would also lead to the establishment of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, which is currently the predecessor of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and helping safeguard that peace. So, having lost the war in Vietnam, saw that domino effect basically come and fall in Southeast Asia, and it would literally look like the international socialism had essentially secured a commanding victory. It was pretty clear that the U.S. really needed to change its strategy because the idea really at this point wasn't to defeat socialism. It has to be to kind of pick it apart bit by bit and drown it out. And they ended up making alliances with states who would consider themselves communists. We talk about Pol Pot in Cambodia. We talk about Joseph Savimbi in Angola. These are people who call themselves communists who were allied with the West against other communist states. So it comes to fruition that the U.S. changing strategy of containment, it cannot monolithicize this idea of international socialism. It has to contend it bit by bit, but it has to work smarter and more complex. And in order to do that, we have to kind of create some sort of line in the sand. Again, no longer just us versus them, but really a recognition that this really does belong to them. We have to cross that line only when we see necessary. Unfortunately, the Helsinki Accords really did not bear the full weight of legal tenuancy that the Soviet Union had hoped, because the Soviet Union essentially had hoped that this would kind of be, all right, this is the end. You guys can stop now. Can we please just go back and, just end this? Because this is a huge burden for the Soviet Union and its communist allies. Reality, this is sort of a way for the West to buy time to sort of re-engage, which we saw just shortly after in the 1980s, the escalation and re-engagement. And so there was this resurgence in moralism and conservative political interest during the 1980s, which would lead to the escalation and engagement against communist forces. The increasing militarism and exponential spending led to an increased tensions during this period. We have projects like Star Wars. We have massive NATO war games held in Europe, some of the largest since the 1950s, and new confrontations in Europe and globally, forcing the abandonment of political contingencies within the context of international relations. So in other words, the Helsinki Accords, which were basically designed to kind of buy the West some time, sort of hopefully for the East, sort of a way to try to begin the end of the Cold War, it proved to be an agreement built on sand. And so all these ideas that NATO had essentially agreed to, they abandoned them, and they were re-escalating, reinventing the wheel in terms of strategic capability, and they were trying to force a second row with the Eastern Bloc. We actually all know how this turned out, unfortunately. So NATO as global enforcer, the period of unconditional hegemony, 1992 to about 2016. So with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Communist Bloc and the Warsaw Pact, comes a period of NATO sort of surging forward and reshaping the geopolitical landscape of Europe. And with that comes various interventions, most notably in Yugoslavia, which was also a socialist state, but not a member of the Warsaw Pact. And we have various operations to sort of expand NATO beyond the territorial agreements that had been signed in the 70s and 80s and 90s between the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and NATO and its US allies. So NATO essentially becomes a global policeman of Europe and the world. and it sort of allows U.S. hegemony to spread beyond the scope of what we understand it, what we understood it to be in during the Cold War. So then there's this expansion of NATO, right? So despite agreements signed during the Cold War, which sought to prevent the expansion of NATO, U.S. unilateral hegemony would see that these agreements are disregarded. Over the course of the late 1990s and early 2000s, saw one of the greatest enlargements of NATO since the 1950s. Many nations of the former communist bloc, once considered enemies of the West, were now welcomed with open arms. NATO now spans from the Bering Sea to the Gulf of Finland, directly on the borders of the former Soviet Union, and even including several former Soviet republics. So the Helsinki Accords were essentially designed to prevent the expansion of NATO beyond what already existed, with East Germany sort of being absorbed into the West Germany, creating the new Federal Republic. This essentially establishes, supposed to establish the farthest eastern border of NATO. But in the late 1990s, with U.S. hegemony sort of unchallenged, it became clear that, well, we could simply just avoid those agreements altogether and just expand eastward as nations of Europe saw fit. And, the nations of Europe having now very highly nationalistic and conservative governments, worried about intervention from Russia and all these things, they decide, oh, this is a great opportunity to join NATO. And so they do. And these agreements are violated wholeheartedly. And now NATO spans basically to the borders of the former Soviet Union, and in some cases include several former Soviet republics, and including Georgia and the Baltic states. And these are aspects of NATO that have clearly shown NATO's willingness to go beyond any sort of agreement and break those agreements if necessary in order to achieve the strategic aim it set out for itself. So NATO in the 21st century, right? With the end of the Cold War and the ideological barriers between European nations now curbed, NATO's role in global affairs now comes into question, right? So since 2001, NATO has been waging a new conflict, not against international socialism, but against the so-called global war on terror. But with the war moving closer towards strategic industrial parity, with the reconstruction and revitalization of Europe and the emergence of new great powers, what is NATO's purpose other than to preserve a global order that no longer exists? So this idea that NATO defending the Western civilization from foreign threats, well, since the foreign threat used to be international socialism, that doesn't really apply anymore because the Soviet Union's gone, and maybe you can include China, but they're not in Europe. But you have the war on terror, right? These other fundamentalist aspects that are challenging Western civilization, quote unquote. And there's always going to be a new boogeyman, a new front to force this unity. Because really, in the end, it's not about defending Western civilization. It's about defending the interests of capital, and that's what's so appealing about it. You can manipulate it to any way, shape, or extent you can in order to achieve those goals without having to actually defend the aspects of freedom. And in fact, many countries who were members of NATO in the 20th century, right? Countries like Turkey and Greece, they had military dictatorships. Portugal was not a democracy until 1975. Spain, who had just became a democracy in the early 80s, they finally ended up joining, but they were in tight cooperation with NATO throughout the Francoist era. And these ideas that NATO works to fight for freedom and democracy when many of its key members aren't even liberal democracies by those definitions that they had set for themselves, really underscores the notion of the defense of freedom. And this really creates a new dynamic, especially in the 21st century, where European powers don't have to listen to the United States in such a keen way and can pursue their own independent foreign policies. So NATO, why it needs to end. So we have the crisis of unsustainable power. With Europe having fully recovered from the destruction of the Second World War, many nations on the continent are veering away from US-guided foreign policy. The extraordinary costs, coupled with the inefficiencies of political institutions in the United States, are exhausting the interests that uphold organizations like NATO. Constant interventions and applied uses of hard power as a tool for international relations are alienating many nations of the West from the ever-growing world beyond their purview. Nations within the West, with few exceptions, want to maintain mutual relationships with countries beyond the scope of U.S. hegemony. These efforts challenge the underpinnings of the global order as had been established by the United States post-World War II. So as nations have recovered from the Second World War, and as nations seek their own foreign policies, it's not always their interest and their interests and the interests of the United States don't always align, right? So when countries like Germany and France want to sign trade deals with China or Iran or Russia, the U.S. is always going to have a problem with that because that's outside of America's hegemonic purview. But these nations in Europe, they want to have mutual beneficial relationship with these countries because it is economically beneficial for them. And that's sort of the dynamic that we see ourselves in the 21st century today. Europe is sort of acting on its own. They are not gleefully, blindly following U.S. foreign policy. They don't have to. And so it calls into notion the very existence of NATO, because although these virtues and principles that so-called unite the Western civilization exist, at least in their minds, they can't put that into action because the material reality of the global situation has changed and no longer affords NATO that sort of legitimacy. So we have states as independent actors. In the end, it should be noted that many of the states that exist within the context of NATO are not simply puppets of the United States or adhere to abstract notions of quote-unquote Western civilizations. Western civilization, sorry, singular. These nations maintain their own interests and perceptions of the world and can act accordingly as a result of continued economic growth and political sovereignty. In some cases, these independent states may seek to establish their own hegemonic systems, while others seek to establish greater cooperation with new systems of multilateral development. So again, nations of the European Union trying to work with China and Russia on actual material issues. You have countries like Turkey who unilaterally invaded Syria, starting their own hegemonic blocks. But the idea is that these countries of NATO, NATO is not a monolithic thing. And I think that's also another thing people should take away from this presentation. NATO does not exist as one monolithic power block. It is actually an alliance of 30 countries, but all these countries are in fact different. And these countries have different interests. Some don't always align with each other. And so we see these things taking place. And that's sort of putting strain on the relationship because there really does not exist any sort of existential threat, right? Except in the view of US hegemony. And if Europe isn't part of the US hegemony and has its own system of mutual multilateral global development, that actually threatens the US hegemony. So America has made many efforts to try and prevent this from happening. But again, these aspects are things that we're going to see play out long term, right? In terms of the relationship within NATO and how NATO operates as a structural entity. So the future beyond hegemony. There does indeed exist a future beyond hegemony. This future can be built from the ascension of nations toward the goals of a true multilateral global system, one in which nations are developed and ideas are shared amongst partners for mutual dialogue. In the twilight of Western hegemony comes the material conditions for a better future for all humankind, not simply the West. It is, however, the mandate of the peoples within the West that will decide their own future. There exists a historical material responsibility to bring an end to hegemony and to look beyond the scope of empire. In China, we see the Belt and Road Initiative. We see dialogue between the EU and Russia. But more importantly, we see aspects of nations looking out for the mutual benefit of all parties, right? This idea of multilateralism. And it's challenging that U.S. global system. It is preventing the U.S. global system from growing and expanding because the U.S. global system is archaic. It has nowhere else to expand to because it's already done so. And so the United States has a choice in this matter, right? We have a choice to join a multilateral global network for the benefit of humanity, using our material resources and scientific minds to promote this idea of the multilateral global order, or we can continue hard, fast, down to the knuckle, defending this old system until it could very well break the United States. And that's sort of the place we find ourselves. And NATO is just one component to that. NATO is one glaringly important component to that. And it's going to be an issue going forward. A world beyond NATO is possible. I think a world where NATO is more constructive is possible. But the way things are today and the way NATO exists today is unsustainable. And its continued existence as it exists today is not possible. In conclusion, thank you so much for joining us for this presentation. It's been an honor and a privilege to speak with you today. I want to thank personally Caleb Maupin for allowing me to be here and giving this presentation. It is always wonderful to talk to everyone here, and I hope we can bring more information next time, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. So thank you.
Right on, comrade. That was very in-depth and informative and inspiring. Truly lives up to the name Center for Political Innovation. Probably one that caught me was the absolute waste, so-called efficiency of the West, or efficiency of capitalism. I mean, how much childcare and education and roads and infrastructure can we invest in the absolute waste of these military screw ups? It's absolutely disgusting. And you've shown and given hope. Hopefully, it is on its way out. We, the people, will continue to change that. Now we're going to get into our question and answer portion of tonight. Was there anybody here that wanted to have a question that we have on video chat? No? Okay. Well, we have a few prepared questions from contacts. I can pull those up. Bear with me 1 second. Here we are. And here's a question for, we have comrades Delaney and Ariel with us. Okay. How have powerful women such as Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, AOC, Nancy Pelosi, etc., benefited from the intersectional struggles of the working class women? And how have they used liberal feminism as a weapon against class struggle? How must working women, Marxist and revolutionary feminists, reclaim feminist struggle from bourgeois Oedipal reductionists?
Well, to start off, I think it's really important to note that while they've benefited from truly intersectional struggles of working women, they've gone ahead and turned around those women specifically and weaponized the idea of intersectionality against those very same working women. Many of those working women who have fought long and hard for the rights that they now enjoy and have used to propel themselves to success were perhaps distasteful to the bourgeois, what's the word I'm looking for, decorum in one way, shape, or form, and would very easily be put, as Hillary Clinton put so infamously, straight into a basket of deplorables for one, passe opinion or another, because really to these women specifically, what matters more than your track record and your accomplishments and your solidarity with others is whether or not you can jump through the right hoops verbally. It's a means of class gatekeeping, of course, as we all know. But I believe that working women, Marxist, revolutionary feminists, in order to reclaim that feminist struggle and that truly intersectional struggle, we need to move away from the dialectic of this nebulous, hyper-individualist, postmodernist, even identity politic, and go back to a politic that is based in things that are tangible, things that matter to women, no matter what class they belong to, because they are universal experiences in one way, shape, or form. Whether or not they happen to you is kind of moot entirely. Like, for example, I'm going to go out there and campaign just as hard as a mother of, 3 or 4 for universal childcare, despite the fact that I myself, as of earlier this year, am unable to have my own kids, which is great because I didn't want them in the first place. But, that is an experience that I've seen my peers who are also women struggle with, and that I've helped them with. And it's these types of tangible experiences that really will form the basis for moving forward in the feminist struggle, rather than this sort of culture warring labyrinth of discourse that's guarded by these veritable minotaurs of the likes of Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton and what have you, if you ask me. Do you have anything else to say on that, Erica?
I really think it all comes down to the identity politics. We're so easily distracted and divided from the factors that unite us, and we can't continue to let that happen in any aspect of feminism, of leftism. We need to come together over our shared experiences, over the things that affect us most universally, and make those necessary changes.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that this type of bourgeois feminism is, the prototypical example of what Mark Fisher called the vampire's castle. It's this endless trap that you're stuck in. That's just it's a mirage, and it's meant to imprison you. And I think that we would do best to, rather than fight against it with words, just fight against it with the action of ignoring that useless discourse and showing the world what we mean with our actions, just like integrity and activism used to do.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's all we got on that.
Yeah.
Wow, great response, comrades. Looks like we got a request. Caleb Moppin, can you talk about the books being offered by Center for Political Innovation?
I sure can. It's actually really very relevant to what we're talking about here. But the first book that the Center for Political Innovation ever published was The Green Book by Muammar Gaddafi, our own edition of it. And we in the opening introduction, it discusses the horrendous things that NATO did and the horrendous results of NATO's intervention in Libya. This was the first Center for Political Innovation book. Well over 500 copies of it have sold. People all over the United States are reading it. Of all the editions of Gaddafi's Green Book that are available on Amazon, ours is the highest rated. It's a great achievement. And it kind of gives an anti-imperialist, pro-socialist, but non-dogmatic analysis of Libya, as well as the actual, words of Gaddafi. It has, the words, it's the Green Book. I mean, we have, Gaddafi in here. We have the actual, the graphic about what the Libyan government and the people's assemblies, was like. We have the actual words. So one thing we are encouraging folks to do, as things are still, there are still, restrictions going on. You can't exactly just go out on the street and do everything, but there are a lot of protests happening around the country around different issues. So if you would like to distribute copies of the Green Book, we can send them to you at a much cheaper bulk rate. I mean, the official rate that it costs is $7 on Amazon. But if you are willing to take these to demonstrations or left-wing gatherings and distribute them, we can get them to you for a much, much lower rate and get the message out about the Center for Political Innovation. I just wanted to make that clear. And this is the Green Book, and it has a very important introduction that explains, NATO and such. Now, I also wanted to mention the educational manual for the Center for Political Innovation. We are city builders, This is widely available. It's available, and again, if you want to get a bulk rate, just contact us. If not, you can just order it directly from Amazon. But we are city builders. This is an educational manual. It's kind of a textbook with an introduction to Marxist ideas. It has selections from Marx, from Lenin, from Mao, from Albert Einstein, from others, and it also has the City Builders and Vandals essay on kind of an introduction to the global situation. And different people around the country have been using it for classes. There were some activists in Texas who've been using it for their classes. Dust James has been using it on his working class revolt streams. And it's basically designed, we have questions at the end of every section, and it's designed basically so that people can have classes and educate each other and engage with each other about Marxism with the book. The book is basically a device through which you can have classes about Marxism. So like I said, if you want to get a bulk rate, just please contact us and we can arrange to have them shipped. But we are engaging in educational work. And I did want to mention that, right now, with restrictions, the Center for Political Innovation is somewhat restricted to having these great web conferences. And these are amazing web conferences that we have had. I mean, the presentations we just heard, these are amazing web conferences. We've had some other great web conferences as well. We've had speakers from Iran. We've had the music of David Robics. We've had so many dynamic presentations. But as we head toward May 1st, International Workers' Day, also the day that the vaccine is supposed to be universally available in the United States, we're going to start transitioning the Center for Political Innovation into becoming an in real life political movement, having in real life events around the country, organizing in communities, getting the word out and engaging in political education. We're going to be having some national gatherings, as restrictions permit. Obviously, we cannot do that now, the way things are. So if you want to get involved and be part of a new dynamic effort to get out of the movement and get to the masses, to bring socialism to the American people, to develop a unique form of socialism that can actually address the crisis we're having, by all means, please get involved. We have a Zoom conference that happens every Saturday. We have a Zoom web conference that you can join. And we're going to start having some local activities soon. And pretty soon we're going to be organizing on a national scale. So there's a lot of help that we need with a lot of things, a lot of tasks that need to be done. I believe that everyone watching this right now has a role that they can play as the Center for Political Innovation emerges to become a very important educational institution, promoting socialism, a think tank, developing new winning political formulas for the United States. So by all means, send me an email or contact us in other ways and try to get involved, because there's plenty that needs to be done.
Right on. That's awesome. We got great resources available at Center for Political Innovation. Please contact for bulk rates and to get involved. I guess we'll continue on with our question process, question and answer segment. If people want to get in the comments on YouTube and ask us questions. Ask questions to Delaney and Ariel. Ask questions to Simons. Ask questions to myself. We have maybe I'll go into another prepared question. This one directed at Justin Simons. A year ago this month, North Macedonia joined NATO as their 30th ally. According to recent NATO press release, currently 3 partner countries have also declared their aspirations to NATO membership: Bosnia, Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine. To the extent there is real support in these countries for joining NATO, can you talk a little about who is in favor of their motivations? Justin, I'm not hearing any sound.
Well, sorry for that. I apologize. There we go. So when we talk about NATO expanding, there's a certain caveat with that expression, because there are certain places where NATO just won't go. when we engage in the concept of NATO expansion, and especially into the former Soviet Union countries like Georgia and Ukraine, there are aspects of instability and there are aspects of responsibility on the part of NATO and its obligations, right? So, with the issue regarding Ukraine, the idea of Ukraine being in sort of the Western alignment because of the U.S. supported coup, that's a recent development, and that's not a stable development because there's still an actual conflict going on there. And NATO, if these countries become members of NATO, there is an actual obligation to defend them if they are attacked. And that would actually start a war, a real war. And that's something that NATO actually doesn't want to have happen, because the point of NATO isn't to actually fight, the Russian Federation. It's to simply intimidate them and to bulwark them into going with NATO's demands in terms of the U.S.-centric economic system and the quote-unquote global order, rules-based economic order established by the United States. And so the notion that NATO can expand in these places, yes, Georgia and Ukraine have both willingly aspired to become NATO members, but it's actually on the purview of NATO to try and find a situation where they can be just as good as NATO members, but not exactly NATO members, because there is this conflict that's going on. As in the Caucasus, there was a recent Russo-Georgian war in the early 2000s. There's still a situation in Donbass and the separatists in Ukraine. This idea that you have the fascist government, and they're hammering down and trying to double down on anti-communism and Ukrainian nationalist elements. But the thing is that by integrating these places, you also have to integrate their problems. And so there is an actual limit to NATO expansion, and doing so would really only serve to provoke, their very big other country on the other side of Europe. So that would be an issue where that isn't necessarily beneficial. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, there's another issue in terms of integration, and that is there are certain standards that NATO's tried to put in place. There's issues with Kosovo and the relationship with Serbia, and that again is kind of holding up the whole aspect. Same thing with North Macedonia. North Macedonia recently joined, but the only reason why North Macedonia wasn't accepted earlier was because the country was called Macedonia, and a NATO member, Greece, didn't like that. So they actually had to change the name of Macedonia to North Macedonia to get them approved for NATO membership. Now, who would support these things? Well, there's a lot of hawkish people in the various halls of government in the West, but namely the interests of the United States, right? It's not so much about containing Russia now, it's more about getting captive markets to sell arms and munitions and creating a dynamic where these countries are dependent on the United States and its allies, and creating the economic infrastructure to sort of put them into this global economic system that they've been working so hard to try and defend. So that's sort of the aspect in terms of getting people to support these things, and the elements within the West who support these issues. In terms of elements within these countries who support joining NATO, of course, it's far right, ultra nationalist, anti-communist reactionary forces who have an problem with these things, and also anti-Russian reactionary forces. It's not always about socialism. It's sometimes about ethnic and cultural issues, and they have a very big bone to pick. So they want to assert their dominance. They want to assert their independence, and they, what's a great idea? Let's join the imperialist bloc. So it's a two-way street. The problem is that there are actual material issues with that happening. And so in order to further the expansion of NATO, although I don't think it's impossible, I find that it'd be unlikely they would do that outright without provoking some sort of serious conflict. But also in terms of NATO's actual deliberation process, because NATO is so disunified at this moment, I actually find it hard to believe that many nations will want to join NATO in the future, simply on the basis of the fact that there is this sort of internal conflict going on.
Right on. I'd probably break in ranks here, but I actually have a question myself. I was very happily surprised by the presentation from Ariel. And, like I talked about my background from a military town, I was wondering if you can speak on how we, the working class and imperialist core, are being economically pressured into fighting the wars of the imperialists and dealing with the cost of wars, from mental health to injury to death, and wars that don't represent our interest. And maybe also speaking on, sexism in the military, sexual assault, and other problems with the military culture and the military structure.
Wow, that's quite the question. So to address the first point, how we're sort of pressured into that, it's a very pervasive culture in this country, right? I mean, you have recruiters at high schools talking to kids. Back when I enlisted, which was an embarrassing amount of time ago, it was very common for recruiters just walk around at lunch and be buddy-buddy with you and kind of establish a rapport in especially poorer schools. And like I said earlier, it's very enticing, right? When you're a kid that doesn't have any plans on going to college, when you don't know what you're going to do with your life, the military provides stability. It provides answers. And I'm not sure how common it is anymore, but when I enlisted, sign-on bonuses were plentiful and pretty considerable. So when you don't feel as though you have other options, it's kind of a no-brainer, especially because maybe you don't want to go active duty. Well, they say, well, you can do the reserves and that way you can go to school or work or whatever. So it's definitely a safety net. It really seems too good to be true, and that's because it is. You really don't know what you're getting into unless you're from a pretty heavily military family, which I wasn't.
I was, which is how I avoided it. I mean, with my dad being in the military, I had West Point asking me to attend based on my ASVAB scores, and I told him to kick rocks, much to my dad's chagrin.
But she made the right decision. I really had no idea. So I enlisted when I was 17, and I know a lot of people do. And then you kind of feel locked in. You kind of feel like, well, what am I going to do if I get out? I don't have any of these things to rely on. So once you're in, you get stuck for sure. As to the last question, gender in the military and sexual assault, it's kind of an open secret that it's a huge problem for us. I don't know if anyone here heard about the Marines United scandal from a few years back, but basically there was a group that was created on Facebook for the sole purpose of exchanging inappropriate photos of female Marines, to the point where some of those women ended up testifying in front of Congress. And that group, even though it was shut down initially, was recreated over and over again. And that is the culture in the military, in my experience. In the Marines, it seems to be the worst of all. It's the lowest percentage of females, if I remember correctly. But the Army's not far behind. There's a lot of lip service to that cause, right? They tell us we can always come forward. They're going to have our backs. They're going to do whatever they need to make sure women in the military feel safe. But in practice, I've seen it time and time again. If anything is done at all, it's reprisal against the woman. The male won't get moved. He rarely faces any administrative action. Meanwhile, the woman, the impetus is on her to respond, to decide how far the report goes. And from then on, you sort of have an eye on you. They mostly just want to make sure you don't create trouble. And it's something I think about often. You know, what's the answer then? What do we implement in place of the SHARP program, which is the sexual assault and harassment program they have in place currently? Because essentially all that is a couple times a year they sit you down and they say, you know, don't get somebody super drunk and sexually assault them. Which
has to wine.
You're right. Nobody needs to be told not to do that. We all know that it's not the right answer, but that's the extent of the military's involvement. There's really no widespread victim advocate programs. There's not a lot of resources specific to it. And I don't have an answer. I don't know how to change the culture to one that emphasizes having your buddies back. It is a good old boys club. And I would like to see a culture shift, because I'm very lucky with the unit I'm in to have it be one where that sort of behavior is very condemned. I feel very lucky in the people I'm around to feel as part of that family and to know that they would defend me. But that's not the experience of most women. And I don't have an answer, but it's a change that I would like to see. And it's one of the few reasons that I've stayed in as long as I have, because I can't change the Army. I don't have the rank for that. I'm just a soldier. But it starts at the lowest level. The Army believes that for everything, you start and make a change and address problems where you're at. And if you do well enough, Big Army can take notice. But it's definitely something that's being discussed from female veterans on that kind of niche of military Twitter. But I don't know that there's a universally right answer. But it's an answer I'd like to find someday.
Very powerful testimony, comrade. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's no shock that the systems, the institutions that maintain white supremacy and sexism around the world have white supremacy and sexism within them. It's no another very sad case was the cover-up and the killing of Vanessa Guillen recently, a young Rasa woman in Texas who was most likely sexually assaulted, murdered, and then the military didn't respond for days, and the people rightfully came up and protested against the people of their community, just the coldness of the military and the military's response. Maybe we can go on to another question. Looks like we have a question that's better suited for Comrade Caleb Maupin. Let's see. Would a socialist America, this is from Robert Webb, would a socialist America have more small businesses than there is now?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be absolutely clear that we don't know. That, you know, socialism as it comes to exist in the United States will emerge as the result of struggles that happen. and the broad masses of people being in motion. And, you know, us just drawing up a blueprint or telling you exactly what our ideal vision would be, that wouldn't be scientific, right? Socialism won't happen because those of us on this call or those of us watching this web conference just kind of will it. It will happen because of a huge coalition that will be much bigger than all of us, that will include millions of people. And it'll be those millions of people in the course of their struggle against imperialism and to dismantle capitalism that would ultimately decide the nature of American socialism. There are some socialist societies that have had almost completely state-controlled economies. There have been some socialist societies that have had, you know, a very big market sector. Personally, I suspect, my suspicion is that we would have a big market sector in the United States because of the fact that entrepreneurialism and you know, the desire of people to have an idea and start a business and kind of be their own boss is such a big part of American culture. And if you look at socialism around the world, what has made the government of Nicaragua, the Sandinista government, what has made them so strong is that they've helped millions of Nicaraguans to start their own businesses with their micro entrepreneur program. There's similar programs in Vietnam and in China. And that, you know, socialism means that the banks, factories, and industries, the major centers of economic power, are controlled by society. It means that no more do you have profits in command. It means you have a planned economy with society coming together and organizing the economy. But within that, people having their own restaurants, having their own hotels, having their own bars, having their own, you know, stores, you know, having their own tech startup firms, starting their own apps and designing their own computer apps. All of that, I think, is compatible with socialism. And the notion that socialism means the state controls absolutely everything is not correct. I think worker cooperatives are definitely going to be a big part of American socialism. You know, if you look at, you know, Venezuela has made these independent worker cooperatives a big part of their emerging socialist economy. In China, they have made Huawei Technologies, which is a cooperative, and it was referred to by Harvard Business Review as a great example of profit sharing working. They've made Huawei Technologies into this, you know, huge state-controlled, you know, cooperative telecommunications manufacturer. So I can imagine that there will be cooperatives in American socialism. There will be individually private-owned small businesses in American socialism. There will be huge state-run industries in American socialism. And there will probably be forms of enterprises that we don't even know about that will probably emerge as a result of socialism. And you know, any method to raise living standards, to march toward a better future, to, you know, raise the living standards and the life of all, to build kind of a global international community where countries are trading with each other on the basis of win-win cooperation, eliminating poverty, eliminating hunger and want and war and all forms of inequality, moving toward that ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world based on vast material abundance, from each according to their own ability, to each according to their need. There will be many different methods of moving towards that goal, cooperating with other countries to do so, you know, organizing our economy to do so. So I can imagine that there would be a lot of small businesses. But at the end of the day, we don't really know, because it won't be up to us, right? It will only be the American people in their millions mobilizing to dismantle imperialism that will ultimately decide what form American socialism will have. But I will also say that one of the strengths of countries that have adopted socialism has been their ability to constantly have their socialist system evolve and change. The Soviet Union couldn't bend, so it broke. So, you know, whatever form of socialism would take place in the United States, I would hope that it would be constantly in a state of adjustment, constantly becoming more efficient, constantly experimenting with different forms and different ways of raising living standards and organizing the economy.
Thank you, comrade. And Robert Webb thanks you in the comments as well. I was avoiding this question, but it looks like it's in here by popular demand. It's rather a heavy issue, and I think it's probably best suited for Justin Simons. It's from Lumpia Logic. Is it true that if not for Soviets, the Holocaust documents would have been destroyed by the West?
No, is the short answer. I don't believe that that's true. The United States and the Western Allies had a vested interest, actually, in the dismantlement of the Nazi regime, or if they wouldn't have wasted so many lives and efforts to try and defeat them, and to ally themselves with the Soviet Union in order to do that. So I think covering up the Holocaust would be counterproductive to the highest extreme. In their efforts to rid Central Europe of Nazism and to rid Europe of fascism as a whole, because fascism was a competing ideology to the concept of liberal institutions and the ideas of the global capitalist market as sought after by the U.S. and Britain. So that's my answer.
Right on. Looks like we have another question just popped up in the chat from Sulji. Sulji, is Venezuelan socialism an analog of socialism in the U.S., a Western Hemisphere state, an elective parliamentarian democracy former colony in with a European culture? Probably best suited for Justin Simons.
Is Venezuela? Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
It's in. Can you see it in the
Yeah, I can see it. Okay.
chat?
Venezuela, socialism, analog for socialism in the USA. So I think yes and no. I think when you look at other socialist states, especially in the 21st century, as they are developing, I find that every model in every state has its own quirks and its own history and identity. And when you engage with certain places, yes, there are aspects that can be taken from places, and ideas that can be introduced, but really something as complicated as this, especially building an American socialism, that has to be done organically and through our own ways and institutions and people. So I think, in short, yeah, there's things we can learn from every aspect of socialism throughout the world. And we've seen that. We've seen, the rapid growth and industrial development of China. We've seen the ideas of cooperative institutions being developed in Venezuela, and of course, we have our very nearest Marxist-Leninist nation, Cuba, which has its own quirks and ideas, and institutions that it's developed. But in the long term, these are all things that are informing our worldview, and we can build from these ideas and build from these constructs. But in the grandiose sense, there will be institutions and ideas and constructs that are uniquely derived from our historical material experience in the United States. And I think that's the real key contemplating and really complex aspect of American socialism going forward, is that when we engage in these topics, we're not simply taking one state and then supplanting it in another place. I think a lot of socialists, they do that. I've engaged with people say, well, what we really need is East Germany, but in America. Well, no, we don't. That's actually the opposite. And the thing is that because every social state that's ever existed is adhering to the historical material context in which it exists. And so with the United States and American socialism, we're not taking a socialist state or a socialist mode and just planting it here in America. That makes no sense, and it would fail. It would fail spectacularly. And I think that's the sort of the cautious approach when we engage with socialism or American socialism, is that we have to build it. It is the purview and periphery is on us to make that happen. So that's the nature of American socialism as I see fit. And Venezuela is making great strides in its capability of defending itself from imperialist powers and building socialism in the Bolivarian state. And I think if we work to end U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, I'm sure we'll see even more incredible aspects come out of that country in terms of socialist development. So.
Wow. Okay. Very informative answer. I think we'll revert back to some of our question submissions. And this one is for Delaney. The gender wage gap in the States is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the gender inequality and the feminization of poverty worldwide. What can Western leftist organizers learn from the struggles of working women worldwide?
Well, to start, I would like to take a minute just to. It might seem pedantic at first, what I'm about to say here, but it's not so much that there is a gender inequality worldwide as there is a sex inequality worldwide, because the conception of gender does not stay static from culture to culture and time period to time period, whereas the feminization of poverty certainly does. And this is due to, as I've said before, just material realities and the axes along which women are used and abused. And I think that just to keep it like short and sweet, because I believe that brevity is the soul of wit, among other things. I think the number one thing that Western leftist organizers can learn from the struggles of working women worldwide, if we really want to call ourselves leftists, is that this notion that prostitution can somehow be a tool for liberation is just patently and disgustingly false. Most women and children who are in this industry, engaged in this sort of work, they're there not of their own volition, and they're there from a young age, and they know nothing else, and they have no way of escaping. And the movements to decriminalize and legalize this abuse and use of women in the Western states is absolutely horrifying, not just from a position of being in that class of people, but from the position of being a leftist. I mean, we think that it is fundamentally opposed to the well-being of the species to exploit another worker's labor, and yet when it comes to women, though, when it comes to exploiting her literal existence, her literal body, it is somehow liberatory. Give me a break. I mean, I believe it was Fidel Castro, actually, who made the observation that when socialism came to Cuba, prostitution died in Cuba, and when socialism was threatened, prostitution would make a rebound. This is telling. And what it should tell us is that in order to truly liberate women worldwide, this notion that we can be bought and sold on the market like steaks needs to die.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a tendency among Western feminists to not look to the global South at all. I don't think we really pay attention to those struggles. And again, it comes down to the identity politics and maybe also an isolated lens. But liberal feminists in this country tend to look down upon feminists in the global South. And I think there really needs to be an effort to look to those women who are making real changes, who are going out and addressing the material concerns of women worldwide,
under threat of their death in many cases.
Right. Just fighting these incredible battles. And we need to look at that and find that courage and find that sort of coherent fight, because right now it's not. We're having this discourse dangled in front of us, and it works for our oppressors. It works for people who want to continue the feminization of poverty because it's lucrative. This divisiveness works for the system that's in place. It works for sexism, it works for capitalism, and we can't continue to let it.
Powerful response. It's what do we start at 7? It's going on near 10. Maybe we'll do one or two more questions. I have a super chat from someone with an interesting name, and I'd actually like to answer this one myself. Big tech censorship and lockdown austerity drive people to right populism, which scares others into backing neoliberal powers that worsen the situation. How do we break the cycle? And I think that's a great question. And I believe he's basically talking about Trump, how people became dissatisfied with politicians like the Clintons, with policies like NAFTA that destroyed the Rust Belt, that destroyed rural communities, that destroyed Mexico and forced people from their homes to come to the United States for work. People hate those policies, so they have to return to what does the political system allow us? They allow us these right-wing demagogues like Trump that are also used by like puppets for the imperialist system. Well, how do we break out of that cycle? Well, the narratives that they show on Fox News and they show on MSNBC are highly controlled. We need to develop working class controlled organizations of the people that can offer an alternative narrative and a narrative of solidarity, a narrative where we can forge our own destinies, where we can unite with our black and brown brothers and sisters and fight against the capitalist enemy and stop the imperialism from destroying us and the planet over. Probably the final question for the night. I would like to involve our young comrade, Max the Sax. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how are these changing global situations as far as the battle between the decaying U.S. empire and maybe the future of multipolarity. How are these aspects coming to play in youth culture?
It's a very interesting question, and it deserves an interesting answer. In terms of youth culture, I can see the decaying of like U.S. imperialism and U.S. like global unipolar hegemony. It's resulting in like a kind of like weird paradox where like people like American youth I remember like there's been like cultural like transformations like in the 60s, like in the 70s or in the early 70s there were the major upsurges amongst the college kids and a lot of high school students. In the 80s you had the neoconservative politics and like the religious right which came to the forefront. In terms of youth culture nowadays, I see a general tendency of pessimism actually developing amongst like a lot of the youth in response to these contradictions of like our decaying capitalist imperial system. I see the rise of like there's a huge explosion in a mental health crisis amongst my generation in terms of depression, in terms of drug use, in terms of alcoholism, and there's a search for meaning. Like there's a search for like, okay, why are we here? What are we doing? We know what's going on, and what's going on is awful. And those questions need to get answered, like for the youth. And as a whole, currently, like in terms of ideological, positions that I see amongst my generation, people usually fall into kind of two categories from what I've seen. Like either like more of like a postmodernist, like synthetic left type bend, like or like a liberal synthetic left type bend, or like if they're more entrepreneurial or right wing, like more of like a libertarian, like free, oh, that wasn't real capitalism type bend. And I think we really need like it is a responsibility of like the revolutionary youth and of actually my organization, Students in Youth for a New America, to present an alternative to this enforced duopoly of libertarianism or like technocratic neoliberalism. And as for that, Students in Youth for a New America is organizing all around the country. I'm getting requests from people like almost daily at this point for like who want to join or set up a chapter in their area. And if you're between the ages of 15 and 25, contact Syna, that's SYNA .beltway, Beltway, combine them, at gmail.com if you want to set up a branch of Syna in your area or your local school. But yeah, I guess that's my answer.
Thank you, comrade. We have another unscheduled question here. We've been joined this whole time from Comrade Wu. I was wondering if you would like, this is a fellow YouTuber, maybe you'd like to tell people about your show and give us a little bit of perspective.
Oh, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this platform. Yes, my name is Comrade Wu from Red Comrades in China. I am currently located in Beijing, and I've created a YouTube channel and organization with Comrade Lawai. You may have seen him sometimes. We comment on the streams. So our organization is about organizing Marxist-Leninists who are in China. We also have Chinese comrades. And basically what our goal is to put out content and information about China that goes against the imperialist narrative. As we can see, we've entered a new Cold War. There's definitely a lot of propaganda going against China. Recently, we hear a lot of stuff about Xinjiang and about the cotton, and a lot of Western companies have made a lot of statements. I will say that everyone in China is deeply upset about this situation. People are calling for boycotts of H&M, Adidas, and other companies as well. So what we essentially would like to do is be in solidarity with the Chinese people against the attacks on them in their country. They've been put on sanctions and tariffs, which essentially do hurt people. Regardless of China's economic strength, it's still an attack on the Chinese people. So what we'd like to do is provide information and knowledge that you wouldn't see on Fox or CNN or the mass media in the West. And we would like to just educate. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade Caleb Maupin, would you like to say a few words in summation before Max the Sax plays us out?
I don't really have much to say. There's been so many great words exchanged, so many great concepts. I'm very excited about the future of the Center for Political Innovation. And I'm looking forward to all the great things we have ahead of us. So I don't really have much more to add. We're building important bridges, both domestically and internationally. We have a bright future of saving socialism so that socialism can save America. So that's how I'll conclude.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade Max the Sax, take us out.
Of course. Solidarity forever, comrades.